The morning Hector Osei-Payne showed up to the garage. He had flour on his hands. Not grease. Flour. He'd been up since 4:30 making lunches for his daughter before the school bus came, and there hadn't been time to wash up properly before the first customer pulled in. So he just wiped his palms on his work pants and got on with it. That was Hector. That had always been Hector. He ran a small auto repair shop out of a converted barn on the edge of Barrie, Ontario, the kind of place that had a hand-painted sign out front and a coffee maker older than half his tools. He'd bought the property 8 years ago after his wife Pauline died, partly because the price was right and partly because he needed something to do with his hands that wasn't just sitting still in a house that had gotten very quiet very fast. His daughter, Imogen, was 9. She had her mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking, and her father's habit of going completely silent when something was wrong. She sat at the counter sometimes after school doing homework, while Hector worked on engines in the bay behind her. They didn't always talk. They didn't need to. The Barrie winters were hard. Business slowed down around February. He'd had months where he paid his suppliers late and called that a win. His hands were always cracked from the cold and the chemicals, and there was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from being the only adult in a house. Not just physically tired, but tired in the way that doesn't show up anywhere you can point to. He had a neighbor, old Mr. Yaboa, who sometimes brought over soup when he thought Hector wasn't eating enough. He had a mechanic who worked part-time, a young guy named Bryce who was decent with transmissions and terrible with customers. He had a daughter who, just last Tuesday, had looked up from her math homework and said, "Dad, did you know the human brain uses the same amount of power as a 10-watt light bulb?" He had said he did not know that. She had nodded like she was confirming something she'd already suspected about him. That was his life. It was small. It was real. He was not unhappy with it. The woman arrived on a Wednesday. She wasn't driving. She was in the back seat of a black Mercedes that pulled off the highway and down his gravel lane like the driver had rehearsed it. The car stopped. The door opened. She stepped out wearing a wool coat that probably cost more than Hector's monthly revenue and looked at the sign above the barn, Osei-Payne Auto, hand-painted in blue, and then looked at him. She said, "Is this the shop that does emergency work?" Hector wiped his hands again. "Depends what you mean by emergency." The car stalled 12 kilometers back on the 400. We coasted in on what was left. "I have a meeting in Toronto in 3 hours, and I cannot miss it." He looked at the Mercedes. The driver was already popping the hood. Hector walked over and leaned in. It took him about 40 seconds. "Fuel pump," he said. "I've got the part." 2 hours, maybe less. She looked at him for a moment like she was recalibrating something. "Fine," she said. "I'll wait." Her name, he found out from the business card she handed him for the invoice, was Claudette Marchetti Obi. The name alone was a whole story. French-Canadian on one side, Nigerian on the other, and the kind of hyphen in between that announced she had stopped trying to make people comfortable with the complexity. She was 44. The card said she was the chief operating officer of a company called Marchetti Obi Holdings, which meant nothing specific to Hector but implied a great deal. She sat in the plastic chair beside the counter, the only chair he had for customers, and she did not complain about it. She made phone calls in a low voice. She accepted the coffee Hector offered without looking up from her laptop, and then, about 20 minutes later, she did look up. "Your daughter drew these?" She was looking at the crayon drawings Imogen had taped to the wall above the counter. A bear wearing a hockey jersey. A house with a sun that had a face. A car that was mostly wheels. She did. Claudette looked at them for a moment longer than Hector expected. "How old?" 9. She nodded and went back to her laptop. He finished the car in an hour and 40 minutes. She paid without negotiating, which in Hector's experience was rare, and she said thank you in a way that sounded like she meant it. Then she got back in the Mercedes and left. He figured that was the end of it. It wasn't. She came back 3 weeks later. Not because the car broke down. She pulled up in a different vehicle this time, a gray SUV, and she walked into the shop at 10 in the morning on a Thursday and asked if he had a few minutes. He said he did. She told him that after the Toronto meeting, which she had made, barely, she'd asked her assistant to look into the shop. She wanted to understand what she'd stumbled onto. The assistant had come back with the basics. One-man operation, purchased 2016, reasonable reviews on Google, no debt but thin margins, sole parent household. Hector set down the wrench he was holding. That's an interesting amount of information to gather about a mechanic, he said. I'm an interesting amount of thorough, she said, and she didn't say it like an apology. She told him she was expanding one of her companies, a logistics firm that ran a fleet of vehicles across southern Ontario, and she was looking for a regional maintenance partner. Someone to manage servicing and emergency repairs for the fleet under contract. It would mean guaranteed monthly revenue. It would mean hiring at least 2 more staff. It would mean the thin margins got a lot less thin. Hector stood there with grease on his forearms and flour long gone, and he said, "Why me?" she said. "Because you diagnosed a fuel pump in 40 seconds without a diagnostic tool, charged me a fair rate, and your kid draws bears in hockey jerseys." He didn't say anything to that. The bears had nothing to do with the business decision, she added. I want to be clear, right? They were a contributing factor to me coming back. He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside, Bryce was doing something with an impact wrench that was probably unnecessary. Hector said he'd need to think about it. He thought about it for 4 days, which was longer than the decision actually required and shorter than his anxiety wanted. He called his accountant, a woman in Midland named Vera Sabo, who had been doing his books since the beginning and who had the particular gift of telling him hard truths without making him feel stupid. Vera looked at the numbers and said, "Hector, if you say no to this, I will lose my mind." He said, "There are risks." She said, "There are also risks in the current situation. They just feel more familiar." Imogen, when he explained it to her at dinner, in simplified terms, mostly about whether they'd be okay, looked at him and said, "Is she nice?" He said, "I think so." "Does she have kids?" He realized he didn't know. "You should find out," Imogen said, and went back to her pasta. He called Claudette's office the next morning and left a message saying he was in principle interested and would she be available to meet again. She called back in 11 minutes. Over the following month, they met 4 times, twice at the shop, once at a coffee shop in Barrie, once at the logistics company's actual office in Vaughan, where Hector wore the only collared shirt he owned and felt, briefly, like an imposter, and then stopped feeling that way when he realized Claudette ran the meeting like she ran everything. Direct, fast, no performance of authority, just the thing itself. He respected that. She had grown up in Sudbury. Her mother was from Quebec City. Her father had come from Lagos in the late 80s and built a small import business that Claudette had eventually folded into a larger company she built herself. She had been married once, briefly, in her 30s. She had a younger brother in Vancouver she talked to every Sunday. She did not have children, but the way she said it was neutral, not sad, a fact she had made her peace with. The contract they signed was modest to begin with, intentionally. She was testing the partnership, so was he, but within 6 weeks it was clear it was going to work. The logistics fleet was maintained better than it had been. Response times on roadside issues dropped. Hector hired 2 full-time mechanics and a part-time admin. The barn got a proper waiting area. Imogen's drawings stayed on the wall. Hector worked the same hours he always had. He just wasn't afraid anymore when he opened the invoices. That was the thing about security that nobody told you. It didn't feel like abundance at first. It felt like the absence of the low hum of dread that had been there so long you'd stopped noticing it was noise. Imogen noticed the difference before he said anything. She started asking more questions at dinner. She started laughing more easily. She started bringing home a friend or two on Fridays, which meant the house was full of noise, and Hector stood in the kitchen making grilled cheese for 4 kids and thought, "This is fine. This is more than fine." Claudette came by the shop one Saturday in March. Not for business, she said, just passing through Barrie. She had been at a family event in Aurelia. She stayed for coffee. She stayed for 3 hours. They talked about things that had nothing to do with fleet maintenance. They talked about the particular grief of being a single parent, which she hadn't experienced, but which she observed in him with a precision that was either clinical or compassionate. He couldn't decide which, and eventually decided it was both. They talked about Sudbury winters versus Barrie winters, a debate with no winner. She told him about her father, who had died 4 years ago, and who she still reached for the phone to call sometimes when something good happened. Hector told her about Pauline, not all of it, not the way you tell someone the whole truth at once, just the edge of it. The way she used to sing when she cooked, badly and without embarrassment. The way Imogen had her exact laugh. The fact that the barn had been Pauline's idea, actually. She'd seen the listing and said, "Hector, that could be something." Claudette didn't say "I'm sorry" in the reflexive way people said it. She said she had good instincts. He looked at her. "About the barn," she said, "right? And presumably other things." "Yeah," he said, "presumably." He drove home that night. She'd been at his shop, so there wasn't far to go, and Imogen was still up reading, which she wasn't supposed to be at 9:30, and he sat on the edge of her bed, and she put her book down and looked at him with those eyes that were Pauline's eyes and said, "Did something good happen?" He said, "I think so." She said, "Okay," and went back to her book. Spring came, and with it the kind of morning that happens in Ontario in late April, where the air is cold but the light is warm and everything smells like the ground thawing out, like possibility with mud in it. Hector opened the shop early. Bryce came in at 7. The new hires, Taiwo and a man named Frederick Achimpong, who went by Freddy and was the best diagnostic mechanic Hector had ever worked with, arrived at 1:30. They had 8 vehicles scheduled that morning. They had a contract that was up for renewal, and the renewal included an expansion to the Ottawa fleet. Vera had called to say the year-end numbers were, in her words, almost offensively good for a single location independent shop. Hector had laughed at that for longer than he intended to. At noon, a courier arrived with an envelope addressed to him personally. Inside was a letter from Claudette, and a separate document he didn't immediately understand. He read the letter first. It was professional in structure and not entirely professional in tone, which was by now characteristic of how she communicated with him. She told him she was restructuring the holding company. She was formalizing the partnership with his shop at a level that went beyond a service contract. She was offering him an equity stake in the logistics division. Small, defined, with clear terms. Because, she wrote, the growth in fleet reliability over the past year could be attributed directly to his operation, and she believed in compensating for actual value rather than perceived value. The last paragraph said, "This is a business offer. If it is also something else, I'd rather find out over dinner than over a contract signing. But the offer stands either way." Hector set the letter down. He picked it up again. He read the last paragraph again. Outside, a truck was pulling in. Freddy was already walking toward it, wiping his hands on a cloth, nodding at the driver. Bryce was saying something to Taiwo that made Taiwo laugh. The coffee maker in the corner was making its particular old machine sound, which was somewhere between a groan and a suggestion. Hector folded the letter carefully and put it in his breast pocket. He would call Vera first. He would read the document properly. He would take his time. Then he went outside to help with the truck, because there was still work to do and the day was still going. And that was the thing about Hector Osei-Payne. He had never been the kind of man who stopped in the middle of things. Imogen found out about dinner the way she found out about most things. She asked a direct question, and Hector answered it honestly, because he had decided early on that honesty, with a 9-year-old, even when awkward, was better than the alternative. She thought about it for a moment and then said, "The bear lady?" He said, "She liked your bears, yes. That's a good sign," Imogen said, with the authority of someone who had developed strong opinions about character assessment. People who like kids' drawings are usually not mean. Hector said that was probably true. "You should wear the blue shirt," she said. "Not the other one." He wore the blue shirt. Dinner was in Barrie, not Toronto, her choice, which he appreciated. They talked for 2.5 hours. They didn't talk about the contract. They talked about everything adjacent to it, the way two people do when the real conversation is already happening underneath. Walking back to their respective cars afterward, Claudette stopped on the sidewalk and looked at him with that precise, direct way she had, not performing anything, just looking, and said, "I think this is going to be good," he said. "The partnership?" she said. "Sure, that too." He drove home with the windows down a little even though it was still cold, because the air felt like it was worth letting in. Mr. Yaboa's lights were still on next door. The barn was dark and locked and full of tomorrow's work. Inside the house, Imogen was asleep, one arm around the stuffed bear she'd had since she was 3, and still wouldn't give up. Hector stood in the doorway of her room for a moment. He thought about the way a life could be going in one direction for a very long time, and then a car could stall on the 400, and the direction could shift. Not violently, not overnight, but the way a road curves. Gradually, then completely. He thought about Pauline, the way he did every night, the way he expected he always would. Then he thought about tomorrow. He turned off the light and went to bed. If there's one thing this story wants you to take with you, especially if you've ever been the only adult in a quiet house, the one who makes the lunches and pays the bills and wonders if this is it, it's this. Sometimes the thing that changes your life pulls up in a broken car, and sometimes it comes back on purpose.